Chapter 3, Body as a Whole. The human body is a highly organized structure composed of many interconnected parts, each playing a vital role in maintaining life and health. Here we can see the body's level of organization. The largest structures are the organ systems. These include systems like the nervous system, cardiovascular system, and digestive system, which work together to perform complex functions. Organ systems are made of organs. For example, the digestive system includes organs like the stomach, intestine, and the liver. Organs are formed from tissue, each tissue type. There's 4 tissue types: connective, epithelial, muscular, and nervous, have these specialized cells that perform their specific roles. Tissues are composed of cells. Cells are the building blocks of life, containing organelles like nucleus, mitochondria that carry essential functions for the cell. These cells contain organelles, which are made up of molecules. Molecules such as proteins and DNA and fats and carbohydrates are all chemical structure that enable life processes. Molecules can be broken down into atoms. Atoms are the smallest unit of matter, forming the foundation of all living and non-living things. This hierarchical organization from atoms to organ systems demonstrates how every level of structure is interconnected and essential for the body's function. Here, we're looking at the cell. The largest structures are the organ systems, as we talked about, but now we're going to be focusing on the cell. A zygote is the single fertilized egg that marks the beginning of a human being. Sperm and egg combine, you have a zygote. Fertilization occurs when the sperm cell successfully enters an egg cell, forming this first cell of life. This takes place primarily in the fallopian tube of the female. This right here you can see is a microscopic image of the zygote, and it begins the process of division and multiplication, ultimately creating millions of cells that form a complete human body. Cytology is a branch of science that focuses on the structure and function of cells. Understanding cells is crucial because they are the building blocks of life and the formation for studying tissue, organs, and the entire organ system. A thorough grasp of cell structure and function forms the basis for understanding anatomy, physiology, pathology, and other fields of the sciences. Every tissue and organ in the body arises from cellular organizations, making this knowledge essential for comprehending complex body systems. So here you can basically see this image that's provided for you that is giving you what exactly we're looking for. All right, now, next. Here, we're going to be focusing on pronouncing certain terminologies, the pronunciations. So you see the word atom. Atom is the smallest unit of matter. Blastocyst. This is the name of the developing embryo during the first 2 weeks after fertilization. Holistic. Holistic means pertaining to the whole, often used in reference to comprehensive or whole body approaches to health. Tissue, a collection of similar cells that work together to perform a specific function in an organ. Zygote, terminology we talked from the previous slide, is a fertilized egg marking the beginning of human development. Now, let's look at more word analysis. Identifying the roots in the following words. All right, you have cellular. The root is cellule, meaning cell. Full definition, pertaining to the cell. Organelle. The root organ means part of a cell having specialized function. Full definition, a structure within a cell with a specific function like the mitochondria or the nucleus. Molecule, the root molic, pertaining to a small particle, a very small particle. Full definition, pertaining to molecules or very small particles. Here, we're looking at structures and functions of a cell. This is a medical terminology course, but again, we're going to briefly go over some terminology that's related in terms of anatomy, physiology, or even pathology. So when we look here, looking at the introduction to cellular function, one thing to highlight is the different terminologies. What is the basic function of a cell? Here I provided manufacture. So cells can produce proteins and lipid which serve as nutrients to sustain cellular processes. These building blocks are essential for growth, repair, and overall function. Production, primarily production of energy. Cells generate energy to power all their functions, primarily through the process like respiration in the mitochondria. Without sufficient energy, cellular activities would cease to exist. Communication. Cells communicate with each other using hormones, chemical messengers, neurotransmitters, which are primarily responsible for understanding the external environment. Replication. Each cell replicates its own DNA or genetic material to control heredity and prepare for cell divisions. Any mistakes in DNA replication can lead to certain types of congenital diseases and even cellular death and deformities. For example, cancers result from errors in DNA replication that can lead to uncontrolled cell growth. Reproduction. Cells reproduce to replace those that died naturally, ensuring the body remains functional and healthy. Here, we have the different structures of a cell. So this figure illustrates the many parts of the cell showcase its intricate and organized structures. These parts, or organelles, are essential for the cell function. Each organelle has its own specific job, working together to ensure the cell operates efficiently and effectively. So one thing I want you guys to do is if you want, pause the video and take a moment to observe the figure and identify some of the organelles you can. For example, which structure do you guys think is responsible for producing energy? A very easy way of looking at that. What is the powerhouse of the cell? Answer, mitochondria. Okay. Or which one controls activities that are responsible for holding genetic information? Answer, nucleus. All right. Now, looking here, let's focus on a few key components. So the outermost covering of a cell is the cell membrane. Its primary function is to give the cell its shape, protect it from outside environment, act as a barrier, and allow for export of material in and out of the cell. Inside the cell, you'll find cytoplasm, a clear jelly-like fluid that fills the cell and supports the organelles by providing a medium in which they float and interact. Now, again, with a group, you can explore the figure together and think about how these other cells and organelles that are involved, how they can contribute to the cell's efficacy. Let's work on more pronunciation. Cytoplasm. Cytoplasm, as we mentioned before, is the clear gelatinous substance that fills a cell, forming its substance and surrounding the nucleus. It acts as a medium where a cellular process occurs. Mitochondria. Mitochondria, as we mentioned before, is the powerhouse of the cell. It's responsible for producing ATP, adenosine triphosphate, and that is primarily utilized for the generation of all functions for anything that requires energy. Deoxyribonucleic acid, DNA. This is the molecule that carries genetic information and is the source of hereditary characteristic. It determines how the cell functions and replicates. Now, let's focus on the nucleus. The nucleus is the largest organelle within the cell and is often considered the control center of the cell. While most cells have a nucleus, red blood cells are an exception. They do not contain a nucleus. In contrast, some cells, such as liver and muscle cells, may contain multiple nuclei to meet their functional demand. The DNA is responsible for replication and duplication of cells in house and is housed within the nucleus, making it central to hereditary and cellular reproduction. The nucleus is surrounded by what we call a nuclear membrane, which acts as a protective barrier. This membrane contains small openings called pores, allowing for essential materials like RNA and proteins to move in and out of nucleus. The nucleus directs all cellular activity, ensuring the cell function as it should. Ribosomes, which are often associated with the nucleus, manufacture proteins, a vital substance that requires for the body's survival. Think of proteins as a fuel and food for the body. It provides the energy and material it needs for growth, repair, and maintenance. Analyzing some more words. So let's do some more analysis by breaking it down. Okay? Now, here I want you to identify the roots or the combining forms of the following terms. Now, looking here, let's look at catabolism. Root is catabol, meaning the breakdown. Definition, the breakdown of complex substances into simpler ones as essential part of metabolism. Endoplasmic reticulum, root, plasma, meaning something that molded, and reticulo, meaning network. Definition, a structure inside the cell responsible for synthesizing steroids, detoxifying drugs, and manufacturing the cell membrane. Lysosome, combining from lyso, meaning to dissolve or break down. Definition, an enzyme containing an organelle that digests foreign material and cellular debris. Nucleus, combining form, nucleo, meaning nucleus. Definition, a small mass within the nucleus that manufactures ribosomes, which in turn produce protein. So here are basically different types of tissues. There's different types primary tissue. Again, there's subgroups you'll learn in anatomy and physiology, but for this course, we're going to primarily focus on these four. You're going to have connective tissue, function, binds, supports, protect, fills space, and stores fat. So if I were to ask you, can you name an example of connective tissue? Answer, blood, bone, cartilage, fat. Let's look at epithelial tissue now. Function, protection, secretion, absorption, excretion. Okay, so based off of this, where might you find epithelial tissue? Some examples would be like the skin or lining of the internal organs and of the digestive system. So one thing to look at is that the epithelial tissue acts as a barrier and it involves with secretions and absorptions. Third, muscle tissue. Primary function controls movement. Okay, so examples of some muscle tissue. There's three types you'll learn. Skeletal, which is bound to bone. Smooth muscle, which is bound to visceral organs like the stomach, respiratory tract, urinary tract, and cardiac, primarily found in the heart. Lastly, you have the nervous system, or nervous tissue, excuse me. Function is to receive, transmit, and process information. Okay, so it transmits impulses for coordination, motor function, and sensory reception. These include places that you can find nervous tissue would be like the brain, spinal cord, and the nerves. Now, if we go deeper into connective tissue, here in this case, you can see a knee joint. When we look here, you have the knee joint. you're going to learn about three different bones that can create the knee joint: the tibia, femur, the tibia, femur, and patella. So tibia is the larger bone on the lower leg. Femur is the thigh bone of the upper leg, and the patella is basically the kneecap. All right. Here, I want you to be able to identify where these bones are located on your own knees. So pause the video and try to locate them on your own knees. Now, here you also have different types of connective tissues like cartilage and ligaments. Cartilage is this rubbery, flexible substance that cushions the joint and reduces friction between the bones. Ligaments are these bands of connective tissue, very tough tissue, that are responsible for stabilizing a joint by primarily connecting bones to each other. Okay. Question: why is it important for cartilage and ligaments to work together in the knee joint? On your own, I want you to think about it. Well, if there is any kind of lack of coordination between these two chemical structures or these tissue structures, then there will be some pathological progression based off of lack of balance. Here, structures that attach muscles to bone. What do we call those? Those are tendons. Tendons, again, tough tissue, tough type of connective tissue that's responsible for connecting muscle to bone. Okay? You also have synovial fluid found in this connective tissue, in this knee joint. Okay? Synovial fluid serves as this two critical function, is primarily responsible for allowing for this freely movable joint without the creation of friction, and it supplies nutrients to the joints, cartilage, keeping it healthy and functional. Let's look at word differences. When we look at word differences, it's primarily important for you to be able to look at the roots, the prefixes and suffixes, and have terminology that may sound like they are the same. They'll have variant functions depending on the terminology. So for example, you have osteoblast. So the word osteo, first of all, it means bones. All right, so that will be used as a root to determine bone. Here I have three terminologies that both have the word osteo in it. You have osteoblast, osteoclast, and osteocyte. Blast means form or produce. Another name for it would be referred to as some kind of immature cell. So osteoblast would be a cell that's responsible for the formation of new bone or an immature bone cell. Osteocyte, cyte means bone maintenance, okay, or mature cell. So osteocyte would be a cell that maintains bone tissue and helps regulate mineral content, or you can say mature bone cell. Lastly, you have osteoclast. Clast means breakdown or removal. Breakdown or removal, combining together for osteoclast, is a specialized type of cell found in bone that's responsible for breaking down and removing bone. So those would be examples of how you can differentiate the different words based off of either the root, suffixes, or prefixes. Now, looking here, we have the organ and organ systems. So there's going to be primarily 11. So right here, I have 11 for you. So 11 organ systems. Each of them will have their function, and I'll briefly mention a couple organs involved in these organ systems. So let's start off with the first one, integumentary system, primarily responsible for protecting the body, regulating temperature, and preventing water loss. Examples: skin, hair, nails. Skeletal system provides structure, support, and production of blood cells and mineral storage. Examples: bones, joints, ligaments. Muscular system, primarily responsible for movement, posture, and the production of heat. Examples: skeletal, smooth, and cardiac muscle. Nervous system. Nervous system is primarily responsible for receiving, processing, and transmitting information. Organs that involve brain, spinal cord, and the peripheral nerves. Endocrine system. Endocrine system is primarily responsible for the production of hormones and regulating metabolic growth and reproduction. Here, examples of endocrine system are any kind of glands, right? So in this case, thyroid gland, adrenal gland, pancreas, pineal gland. Cardiovascular system. Cardiovascular system is responsible for transporting nutrients, oxygens, and metabolic waste. Examples include heart, blood vessels, and blood. Lymphatic system, primarily responsible for immunity, so protection against infection and pathogens. So pathogen is something that causes some kind of disease, so some bacteria, viruses, parasites. Regulation of fluid and absorption of fat. Lymphatic structures include lymph nodes, lymphatic vessels, spleens, parts of the liver. Digestive system. What does the digestive system do? To digest, okay, that's lazy. Breaks down foods, absorbs nutrients, and eliminates waste. This includes the esophagus, stomach, intestine, large intestine, small intestine. Respiratory system is primarily responsible for ventilation and gas exchange. Structures include lung, trachea, diaphragm. You have the urinary system, primarily responsible for removing waste product and regulating fluid and electrolyte balances. Structures include kidneys, bladder, ureter, and urethra. Reproductive system. Primary function is to produce offspring and regulate reproductive hormones like testosterone and estrogen. Structures, ovaries, testes, and a lot of other associated areas. So these are the general structures and functions of the 11 organ systems. Now we're going to be looking at the genetics of medicine. So we already mentioned DNA. DNA stands for deoxyribonucleic acid, and it's located where, if you remember, in the nucleus. All right, and all this genetic information is basically a blueprint for code created from 4 base pairs: adenine, thymine, cytosine, and guanine. And this code is going to be responsible for the generation of protein production at the end. You have mitosis. What happens during mitosis? This is basically cell replication. Cell replication in mitosis means that it's going to create an exact a copy of DNA, which will in turn create an exact cell. And the whole purpose of this is to maintain genetic consistency. You have mutations. What's a mutation? Mutation is an alteration of the nucleotide sequence, so the A, T, C's, and G's of the genome, which can lead to some kind of progression of diseases, either congenital diseases, chronic diseases, cancers, that are all provided for you here. Now, here, when we look at genetics in medicine, there's going to be 4 main fields we're going to be looking at. And this is basically groundbreaking fields that are recent in the past couple decades. So what do you think personalized medicine means? Well, personalized medicine tailors prevention and treatment strategies to individuals based off of their genetic profile. So for example, females that acquire ovarian cancers have a mutation in this BRCA1, BRCA2 gene. So knowing this, there could be preventative screening and preventative surgeries to prevent the progression of the cancer of the individual and allow for a higher life expectancy for that female. Cytogenetics. So how might studying chromosomes help us understand developing disorders? Well, cytogenetics focus on chromosomal abnormalities by identifying causes of developmental delays, mental retardations, or birth defects. So, for example, Down syndrome or trisomy 21 is due to an extra copy of a chromosome 21. So instead of two, they have three. Gene therapy. What could happen if a faulty gene is replaced with a healthy one? Gene therapy is this experimental technique that is going through clinical trials where a mutated gene causing diseases is replaced with a healthy copy. This approach offers potential cures for genetic disorders, though it's still in developmental stages. Predictive medicine. So, how can knowing the probability of a disease help the healthcare worker? Preventative medicine acts at individuals' risk for certain diseases based on their genetic makeup. For example, someone with genetic predisposition to diabetes might adopt lifestyle changes to reduce their risk before the disease develops. So these are different characteristics when we involve genetics in medicine. Now, we need to focus on anatomical positioning, planes, and direction. Why is this important? Well, we need a universal language that we can use for healthcare providers or anatomists, physiologists, in order to determine language. So here we have a individual. One thing we're trying to be looking at here is going to be first determining anatomical position. So what does anatomical position mean? Anatomical position is the standard body posture used in anatomy as a reference point. The body is standing erect, feet are flat on the floor, face and eyes are facing forward, arms are at the sides with palms facing forward. This is referred to as the standard anatomical position or supine position, but we'll go more into that. Terminologies to look at now is, for example, how would you define here we have proximal and distal. Proximal and distal refers to being closer to the point of attachment or the trunk of the body, whereas distal is farther from the point of attachment or the trunk of the body. For example, which is distal, the wrist or the elbow? Correct answer, the wrist. Which is proximal, the hip or the knees? Answer, hip. So let's focus on lateral and medial. What does lateral and medial mean? Well, when we look at the midline, midline refers to an imaginary line that is centered, basically divides the individual into two equal left and right hemispheres. Okay? Lateral is referred to as away from the midline, whereas medial is closer to the midline. So if I were to ask you, are your ears lateral or medial to your nose? Answer, lateral. Is your big toe lateral or medial to your pinky toe? Answer, medial. Now let's focus on superior and inferior. What structure is superior, the shoulder or the hips? Superior and inferior, that means up and down. Superior, other terminologies you can use would be, for example, cephalic, towards the head, cranial, also towards the skull. Whereas inferior would be towards the bottom, or even caudal towards the tailbone. So I would ask you again, which structure is superior, the shoulder or the hips? What would you say? The shoulders are superior because they are closer to the head. So again, superior is above or closer to the head. Inferior is below or closer to the feet. Last one, supine and prone position. Supine position or anatomical position is when you're lying flat on your back with your face upwards. For example, you are in the supine position when you're looking up at the ceiling while you're laying down. Prone is the exact opposite, when laying flat on your abdomen with your face downwards. So for example, you are in the prone position during a back examination. So here, looking at these anatomical positions, it's really important to really create this foundational terminology because a lot of anatomy, physiology, pathology, pharmacology, all of this stuff is going to go based off of these terminologies, right? So again, we're going to keep going as for this. Now, here we have other word definitions that I want you to know. So here we have caudal and cephalic. So caudal referring to the tailbone, whereas cephalic towards the head. So what is the difference between these two? So remember, caudal is referring to the tailbone or lower parts of your body. And again, a lot of times you'll see individuals use caudal for a lot of animals, but again, it's still used in humans for anatomy. So for example, caudal, for using caudal, I could say the coccyx or tailbone is caudal to the lumbar spine. Cephalic means closer to the head. So an example of this, the skull is cephalic to the neck. All right. So again, on your own or with groups, can you give an example of something cephalic to the chest? So do that on your own. There could be various amounts of examples. Supine versus prone. Again, what is different between supine versus prone? Supine, as I mentioned, lying flat on your back with your face upwards. Example of this, patients are often in the supine position for abdominal surgeries. Prone, again, is going to be lying on your abdomen with your face downwards. Example, prone position is used for back examination or certain type of physical therapies. Lastly, proximal versus distal. So proximal, what is the difference between proximal and distal? Well, proximal, as we said, is closer to the point of attachment or the trunk of the body. Example, the shoulder is proximal to the wrist. Distal is farther from the body, farther from the point of attachment or the trunk of the body. Example, the fingers are distal to the elbow. You also have three major anatomical plane. Why are these important? Well, if you want to look at studying anatomy or even pathologies, different types of scanning, we use these anatomical planes, right? So these are the three major ones: frontal, transverse, and sagittal. Transverse or horizontal plane divides the body into superior and inferior portions. Sagittal divides the body into bilateral or left and right halves. Sagittal actually has two planes, subplanes, mid-sagittal, which is the cut exactly at the midline, while parasagittal is cut in every regions except the midline. So mid-sagittal is identical halves, whereas parasagittal is unequal parts. And then also you have frontal or coronal planes. This divides the body into anterior and posterior. So anterior front, posterior back sections. Okay. What else? And so again, which areas of the bodies are considered superior and inferior relative to the transverse plane? So superior areas are above the wrist, chest, and head. Inferior areas are below the wrist, no, excuse me, below the waist. For example, the legs and pelvis. Okay, so again, you can use these different examples for yourself in order to understand this terminology. And so here, looking at these anatomical planes, they're very useful in looking at certain diseases. So people that do CT scans or CAT scans, what do? They do these imaging techniques in order to diagnose and find the location of the pathological problem. Word definitions. Okay, so here we're going to focus on more word definitions, looking at the roots and meanings. Okay, so what is the root of each term and what does it mean? Coronal. The root coron means crown. Definition pertaining to the vertical plane, dividing the body into anterior or front and posterior or back portions. Ventral, another terminology, root is vent, meaning belly. Definition pertaining to the belly or situated nearer to the belly. Dorsal, root dors, meaning back. Definition pertaining to the back or situated behind. Okay, so these common suffixes, what is the common suffix in all these terms? And what does it signify? So the suffix al, if you remember from previous chapter, al is referring to meaning to pertaining to. So this suffix indicates that each term describes something related to a specific part of the body. Body cavities. So looking here at these body cavities, during embryonic development and gestation, you have these cavities or these spaces. And each of these spaces will have certain organs that are going to be found. All right. First, I want you to name the 5 body cavities. You have cranial, spinal, thoracic, abdominal, and pelvic cavities. The cranial cavity contains a brain. So what structure protects the cranial cavity if I were to ask you? Answer, the skull. Spinal cavity contains the spinal cord. So which structure would surround the spinal cavity for protection? The vertebrae. You have the thoracic cavity, contains the heart and lungs, as well as major blood vessels like the aorta or the vena cava. And what structures separate the thoracic cavity from the abdominal cavity? The diaphragm. Abdominal cavity contains the stomach, intestine, liver, pancreas, spleen, and kidney. Now, lastly, you have the pelvic cavity. Pelvic cavity contains the bladder and reproductive organs and the rectums. What cavity contains the uterus in the females? Pelvic cavity. Now, here, when we look at these body cavities are really important for understanding what structure is involved and what organs are going to be found in these specific cavities. How are they housed? Now, also, we need to focus on these abdominal quadrants and regions. These are good diagnostic tools for healthcare professionals in order to diagnose diseases involving with majority of the time the digestive system. So first, let's focus on quadrant. Quad, what does that mean? 4. So you're going to have 4 different quadrants. So you're going to have the right upper quadrant, abbreviated RUQ, the left upper quadrant, abbreviated LUQ, right lower quadrant, RLQ, and left lower quadrant, LLQ. All right. So if I were to ask you which quadrant here would you find a liver? You would see the right upper quadrant. Which quadrant would most associate with the appendix? That would be lower here, right lower quadrant. Then on the right side, you can see that there's 9 abdominal regions. And these abdominal regions are going to be a little bit more precise compared to the quadrant. Okay, so you have starting off with the central region. The central region is the umbilical region. And the reason why it's named umbilical, it's basically located, it's the primary location of the navel. The region above and below is the gastric, so near the stomach. On top, we say above is epigastric, below is hypogastric. Next, so for example, what might be found in the epigastric region? So in the epigastric region, you'd have the stomach. What structures would be located in the hypogastric? In this case, answer would be the bladder. You also have 6 lateral regions. So we just identified 3, there's 6 more. So the right and left hypochondric region. So hypo is low, chondro is referring to cartilage. Where do you see cartilage? Your rib cage. So right here, below this region, you have the right and left hypochondric region, chondriac region. And below that, you have the lumbar regions. So you have the lumbar regions right here, the lower back. And then the last and the lowest region that are on the left and right side is the inguinal regions. All right. And so, for example, let's do an engagement question. What organs might be found in the left hypochondriac region? Think about it. Answer, spleen and parts of the stomach. So here is just sort of a little summary of the different parts of the abdominal quadrants and the regions for you to actually use. Here now, we're going to look at comparing the difference between the following terms. All right. So epigastric and hypogastric. So the epigastric means above the stomach. Prefix epi means above. Root gastric means stomach. So gastro is root, and ic means pertaining to. So suffix would be ic in this sense. Versus hypogastric is hypo is the prefix below. Gaster is going to be referring to as the stomach. Ic is pertaining to. All right. Now, looking at this is really important to differentiate the two and figure out what is found in each. All right. So